Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and I'm joined today by my co-host Robert Brandt. Today marks a very significant milestone for Drumbeats as we welcome our first guest from Latin America. We're joined by Juan Dumas, co-founder and partner at Meliquina, a pioneering firm bringing equity partnership models to renewable energy projects across Latin America. Juan's journey began as a mediator, resolving disputes between development finance institutions, energy companies, and Indigenous communities. Conflicts where he discovered something remarkable. Communities weren't opposing projects primarily because of environmental impacts, but because they were being excluded from economic opportunities on their own lands. That insight led Juan and his partner Michelle Haig to create an entirely new approach, drawing directly from Canada's 30-year track record of Indigenous equity partnerships. In our conversation, you'll discover why projects developed with communities from the ground up dramatically reduce risk. Learn about innovative blended finance structures enabling community ownership, and understand how the Canadian experience is being adapted for global application. This is exactly the kind of strategic intelligence that demonstrates why Indigenous partnerships deliver superior investment outcomes. So let's move into the Southern Hemisphere for this fascinating conversation. Good afternoon. We're very pleased today to have Juan Dumas, co-founder and partner at Meliquina from South America. And today I understand, Juan, you're in Ecuador, your home. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Hi, Juan. Nice to see you again. Looking forward to our conversation.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much. Me too.
So, Juan, when we last spoke to you, I think you were in California, if I recall correctly, and you've had many travels since then. So why don't you tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about yourself, because your name has come up in many circles, and you're our first guest from South America. So we're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I have to say I am a very faithful follower of this podcast. So when you reached out and invited me to join you, I was absolutely honored. So thank you so much for that. So I am originally from Argentina, but home today is Ecuador. I'm in Quito today. I'm a proud father of two, and I started my career as a mediator. And so the truth is that I studied law and I didn't like it at all. And so it was a difficult few years studying law. And then towards the end, as I was getting my degree, I took some mediation classes. And I realized that I had found something that I was really passionate about. And before dying in a big law firm, I would try my luck with mediation. And so my first formal job was with a very small NGO in Argentina that was only starting back then doing some mediation in public disputes. And I was hired as an admin person, and my goal was to learn as much as I could. A few months in the job, I was given an opportunity to train myself as a mediator and to start doing some cases with the lead mediators there who were fantastic.
What years are we talking about?
Oh, this is 1999. Yeah, I was 23 years old back then. It was a great opportunity, and I will always be grateful to the person who was leading that organization, because giving me an opportunity to join the team, I had very little knowledge about mediation, but it changed my life, really.
Well, I'm not going to hold it against you that you didn't want to die in a big law firm like I may be destined to. But how did it change your life?
Well, I worked there for 4 years. I learned a lot about mediation in public disputes, social disputes, and environmental disputes. And that prepared me to then take the next step in my career, which was being the executive director of another civil society organization based in Quito. That's what took me here. It was a 3-year contract, and who would have said that 20 years later I would still be here in Ecuador and I would have made my life here. And this was a different organization in the sense that it had a regional scope of work. So it would work in Latin America, not just in Ecuador. And that experience with this organization for 6 years between 2003 and 2009 allowed me to get exposure to the region and to the realities of indigenous peoples, which to me in Argentina was, not as familiar. I used to spend most of my summers in Patagonia, and there I was exposed to the Mapuche indigenous communities. But I would say only for a few months every year when I was going there for vacation. But this opportunity to work in Ecuador, which is a fantastic country, it has an unbelievable natural diversity and cultural diversity. This gave me the opportunity to understand how indigenous peoples live, what their challenges are, what difference it makes to see the world, how they see it. And I realized how ignorant I was. And so this helped me participate in disputes as mediators, where indigenous peoples would be very active participants.
What sort of disputes were you mediating that would involve indigenous people?
So at first, I was mediating disputes related to natural resources management. So, for example, someone wanted to create a protected area in lands that were owned by indigenous peoples, and maybe they didn't feel as that they had been properly consulted. So I would be a mediator in a situation like that. But then I migrated to a different type of disputes, which is disputes related to investments made by DFIs in Latin America. And so these development finance institutions have an accountability mechanism, usually, where communities that feel that they're being impacted by one of their investments, they can submit a complaint. And these mechanisms have the obligation of responding to that complaint. And there are different ways in which they can do that, but one is through a dialogue process, a mediation process. And so they would engage me and ask me to travel to these countries where this dispute was happening and try to work with the communities and with the companies to see whether there was an opportunity to find a solution through a dialogue process. And so I started doing that while I was still working at this NGO, but then I started my own private practice 6 years after leading the NGO. And I was a mediator between 2009 and 2022. So a big chunk of my professional life has been mediating for or around DFI supported projects.
And then I guess carry the story forward from 22. What happened? And I'm sure listeners may be wondering why a South American mediator is on a podcast about Canadian Indigenous investment scene, but maybe you can develop the story a bit more.
Yeah, of course. So I started finding myself in a recurrent situation. Many of these disputes were about projects that I thought didn't have very significant environmental and social impacts. For example, like small hydro run-of-the-river projects in Central America, in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Honduras, different places. But the level of conflict around them was completely disproportionate with the impact. So it was very intense. And so you would see communities fiercely opposing these projects, burning machinery from the companies, the government sending the military in, people were killed, So yeah, tensions would rise and in ways that you wouldn't fully understand, right? And so I started having conversations with the leaders of these communities, and at first they were off the record conversations, and I was asking them, if this project was yours, would you build it? And interestingly, the answer was invariably yes, right? So to me, it became very clear that the problem was not that they were that concerned about the impacts. They were more concerned about being left out of an economic opportunity happening in their lands. And this was happening over and over again in all of the countries that I was working in Latin America. And so that was the spark that led us to me and my partner. I'll tell you a little bit about her now, to start Meliquina, because we realized that we could do things differently if you start developing a project from scratch with the community and you find a way in which the community can become an equity partner, then you have a better project.
And we're talking about indigenous communities?
Yeah, mostly indigenous communities. It doesn't have to be just indigenous communities, but I would say in most of these cases, yes. And the communities that we're working with today, they are primarily indigenous communities. And so we became partners with Michelle Haig. Michelle came from the private equity world, investing in renewable energy. She had the fund she was working for had invested in a project in Mexico that was facing social opposition, and I was impressed by the fact that she and her colleagues had flown from New York to Mexico to try to understand what was going on and try to improve the project where possible. And so when I came up with this idea of, hey, can we try to do something different and start a company? And I brought this idea to her. She said, I'm happy to try this with you. And so we've been doing this together ever since. And I have to say, I'll tell you more in a few minutes, but I have to say this has been the most rewarding experience of my life.
So how did Canada appear on your horizons of places to look? And I think it's timely we're having this discussion when COP is taking place in Brazil as we speak, and there's been some demonstration as well, talking exactly what you're saying about people being excluded from the process. The decisions are being made without them.
So before we started our company, we went to some business leaders in the renewable energy field and asked them whether they would consider including communities as partners, as equity partners. And the reaction was not very positive. They responded that it would be a mess from a governance perspective, from a financial perspective. And at first I thought that maybe there was some truth in that. But then I started researching what was going on in the world. And this was in 2015 or 2016. And I came across some projects in Canada where communities were already equity partners. And I realized that those responses were actually excuses. They just didn't want to do it. And I realized that Canada had been doing this since the early 90s. The first project that I was able to track in Canada started in 1991. And so, yeah, we realized that people were going to be putting excuses if we tried to invite them to do this. So we decided to create our own company and do it ourselves, right? And yes, Canada has been a true lighthouse for us. I like to say that I have traveled to the conference of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition twice. And I like to say that it is a trip to the future, right? I do believe that what Canada has been able to achieve in terms of equity partnerships is something that we should all be looking up to in Latin America. And of course, Canadians will be fast to say that, yes, we still have our difficulties and our challenges, and that's true. But sometimes I think you don't realize how far you've come in Canada and how much of an example you are for the rest of the world. And so we have been learning very many things from Canada. I can go on forever on this, but let me summarize them. What we have learned. First is that these partnerships can be done in market terms if there is a vision, if there is courage from both the corporate and the community side, and the will to do it. And there are several projects that were done in the late 90s, early 2000s that were done with any kind of support from government institutions. They were just done because the communities and the companies, the leaders there, were ready to do these partnerships. So they showed that this can be done and this works. And then all the incentives came later, right? But so I feel that the projects that we are trying to develop in Latin America, and we'll talk about them soon, play that kind of a role. It's like showing the market that this can actually be done, right? Second is separating politics from economics. You had Mike Jameson in your podcast, and he is always very insistent on that. And I think that the experience of the Six Nations of the Grand River really shows that is very true. And then also that even if access to capital for communities can be a big challenge, loan guarantees can play a fantastic role in enabling access to capital for communities.
Juan, do you see some of the financial tools available? That are available in Canada for Indigenous projects? Are there similar tools in South America?
So no, they aren't available yet, and we are actually building a fund that draws a lot of inspiration from the tools that Canada has implemented. And so, we're drawing from the experience of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. Shanna Martineau has been very generous with us, and her team has spoken with us to learn from them. But we have also seen like what Canada has been doing with bridge loans, with some convertible grants, with different government programs as well. None of that is available in Latin America. So we actually have to build all that. And I'm sure we'll talk about the role of development finance institutions. They do have an important role to play here because the credit rating of our state institutions and their balance sheets as well are not as strong as those of Canadian provinces. And the other thing we have learned is that regulatory incentives can go a long way, right? They can really help to take this model to scale. So if you establish like some additional points when you're doing calls for power, and you establish that those projects that have equity partnerships with communities score more points, you're creating a really interesting incentive. If you give those projects priorities to access the grid, the same. And so, I've seen how different provinces in Canada have been, testing these different approaches, and I think they've done amazingly well. If you look at BC's call for power now in 2024 and 2025, the same. And so again, here we are a company and we're developing our own projects in Latin America and advising companies. But at the same time, we're working with governments and bringing them all this information from Canada and saying, hey, this is how they've done it. And, maybe some of them are not fully applicable here, but I'm sure there are ways.
Juan, what are some of the responses that you're getting from the different governments at national and state levels? I think it's really interesting in terms of this discussion. You've only mentioned government now. Up to the whole point of this conversation is about the community on the ground, trying to make a difference. And I think it comes also from your background of mediation, because you're right there at the, as they used to say here, at the coal face, right? And now we've kind of come up and you've talked about obviously the credit rating of the Canadian government and provinces are different than a number of the countries in Latin America. But can you talk a little bit about your conversations with government and what you've seen across the region, where you're able to comment about how different governments perceive enabling, empowering the Indigenous peoples to participate in projects?
Yeah, I would say that first, it is intentional. I have to say from our end, because I think that for too long in Latin America, we have tried to get the state to actually solve all problems. And I think that's not the right way to go. And so what we've tried to do is that this can be done between a company and a community, and show the region that it can work that way. Of course, if the government can play a supporting role and an enabling role for these types of partnerships, then they will be adding a lot of value. And we have seen in the province of Neuquén in Patagonia, where we are developing a solar project with a Mapuche indigenous community, we have seen that the provincial government has been very supportive of our efforts. And interestingly, they haven't tried to sort of invade our space, but rather they've been there to say, hey, whatever you need, we're happy to support you, because you're trying something that, if it works, it can be a model for so many other communities in our province that currently rely on whatever the state can provide them. And these are communities that live in subsistence economy, many of them below the $2 per day per capita. And so for the government to see a model like this work, it is a source of hope and potential transformation in the province. Now, I would say that not all governments react in the same way. And many of them would say, well, this has been tried in Canada, but Canada is such a different country. It's a developed economy. This doesn't work in our region. And again, I believe that's an excuse. Of course, we're not copy and pasting what's being done in Canada, but we sure think that many of the principles and the tools that have been applied in Canada are 100% applicable to our region.
That's so great to hear, Juan. We've been saying for a while that one of the next great exports from Canada will be the way we structure deals with Indigenous people and corporate Canada, and wouldn't necessarily want the rest of the world to copy everything that Canada does with respect to its Indigenous people. But in this area, we are leading, and you're one example of outside Canada looking at those structures and those innovations and trying to apply them. Maybe tell us a bit more about the one particular project you're talking about and working on now. Is it one Indigenous community? Is it several? Is it equity? How much equity? Or how's that kind of, what sector?
Yeah, this is an 18 megawatt solar project in northern Patagonia with one community, the Mapuche Mijaqueo community, and they own 9,500 hectares, and we helped them get the title to the land before we would start developing the project together. And we approached them back in 2018, and we shared with them that we believe they had the right ingredients to do a renewable energy project, but we would only do it with them if they were interested in partnering with us as co-developers and being equity partners as well. And it was interesting. At first, their reaction was like, this is too good to be true. Right? And their previous experiences with energy companies or other types of extractive companies had been very negative. And so they had very good reasons not to trust me or us, the team that visited them that day. But they asked, let's say we say yes. How do we become equity partners? Because if you see out the window, if you look at the windows, all those goats that you can see out there, that's all we have, right? And so this is a $16 million project. You're telling us this is a small project. How on earth do we actually participate? Because we're sure you're not going to hand out any equity. And so we started there there a conversation about how they could be co-developers in the project with us. The truth is that if they push for permits, permits come faster. If they invite investors and banks to come in, those investors and banks realize that the risk of social opposition is probably much lower than in other places. And also that the potential positive social impact of a project like this is much better than what other renewable energy projects can show. And also the communities can attract companies as off-takers of the energy that we will produce together. And so they add plenty of value. We've already seen this in this project. They add plenty of value at the development stage. And so we started doing this. Once they got the title to the land, we went through all the permitting process together. And now we are ready to go to financial close next year. We're discussing with different investors, with banks, and with potential off-takers what the structure of the deal will look like. But hopefully we can get it built next year or start building it next year. And for us, this is only the beginning. This is a project that is a proof of concept in the region, but it has already sparked plenty of interest elsewhere in other countries in the region. We actually now have, with support from the UK government, actually, we have an office in Medellin in Colombia and a team there, and we are working with both companies and communities that are interested in trying this model as well. And we're in early stages of new developments in different regions of Colombia. So we can already see this moving forwards.
Can you, Juan, tell us a little bit more about your involvement with the UK government? As you know, we're based over here in the city of London, and that may surprise some of our audience, how they're enabling and empowering you and your organization, communities you're working with.
Yeah, they have a program to accelerate the transition to the energy transition. It's called UK Pact. And they open calls in different countries in the world for organizations who can show that they can actually advance the energy transition. And so we applied with two other organizations from Colombia, and we were selected for their funding that will go for this year and the following year, 2026. And so the goal is to raise awareness about this model, show that this works, provide assistance to communities and companies that actually want to do and try this model, and then also provide some training to key people in these groups, and also provide some recommendations for regulatory incentives about how this can be scaled up as well. So yeah, we have a very busy a couple of months now, I would say 18 months ahead, doing all of this.
Yes, quite clearly. And, the numbers are big around the globe. And again, coming back to what's going on in Brazil at the moment, I guess Latin America needs approximately 700 billion annually for climate goals, right? So that has to be achieved with community involvement. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Who would put their capital at risk if you don't have the indigenous communities on board?
I fully agree. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity. If you just take Colombia and Argentina and you overlap the map of indigenous owned lands and the map of areas with good wind and solar potential, and you add a feasibility factor, let's say of 40%, you end up with a total addressable market of $25 billion, right? And this is just Colombia and Argentina in the region. And so this presents us with a fantastic opportunity, economic opportunity for the communities that live in those lands. Now, at the same time, there's a risk. We can try to do what we have been doing for decades with the extractive industry, where some handouts are promised to communities, and you can see that their economic situation hasn't changed, hasn't improved, even if all this wealth has come out of their lands, it hasn't gone back to their communities. So we can actually take that path again, and that will lead to more conflict and a missed opportunity. Or we can take the equity partnership model, share the wealth with communities at the source, and this will unlock the energy transition in the region. And it is as simple as that. It is a fantastic opportunity. So we need to actually act very fast so that companies and communities will understand that there's a model out there that we can use and adapt here in the region. And we have to work with financial institutions to show them that they have a role to play so that communities can actually participate in these projects. And so what in relation to your question about the role of the UK, we know that access to capital will be a big issue. So we are putting together a fund. It's called the Community Equity Opportunity Fund. And it is meant to help communities buy into these projects. I'll tell you a little bit how it works. But the interesting thing is that throughout this year, it has been incubated by the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which is heavily funded by the UK government as well, right? I just came back from Brazil, where we got the endorsement from all the members of this lab, which include DFIs, impact investors, and other organizations.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And it's nice from North America to hear that social impact investing, sustainable investment community is still alive and well in some parts of the world.
It is, and I am excited about it. And so if we manage to line up the right investors and development finance institutions, what we will be doing is first providing some early stage development loans so that communities can participate as co-developers in projects. Then we will be doing some equity investments for construction of these projects, but essentially to hold an equity position for the communities to be able to buy us out. So we play a role in building what is called now an impact enhancing exit, right? So we plan for our exit in favor of the communities, and we help the communities get the equity loan to buy us out. So when I was in California and we had our chat a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to some of these impact investors that are showing some interest in trying this model. So it's building up nicely. Let's hope that next year we can deploy our first investments.
I'm curious, Juan, you've talked about copying the Canadian model and what you've learned from the Canadian model of doing deals with Indigenous people. Are there any lessons that you think Canadians could learn from the way you're doing things in Latin America?
I don't know. I think I am so biased towards Canada and in favor of Canada that I kind of think that there is very little that you can learn from us. But if there was only one thing that I think I can mention is that I think that Canada has made an incredible amount of progress in allowing the communities to buy into projects once those projects have been developed and built and almost in operation, right? But there are less examples of projects that are developed fully from scratch, right? And in fact, there are quite a few First Nations that have started their own projects themselves, like MMBC in Quebec or Henry Inlet in Ontario, for example. But those are exceptions. In general, you can see a project that is led by a well-established energy company, and then an opportunity for communities to raise the capital and buy into that project is built into the agreements for construction. So I think that the more we can see that effort of engaging from scratch, even if it takes more time, actually it leads to much better outcomes for everybody.
Yeah. Yep, that's a fair comment. Some of those projects are coming, and we've talked to about Cedar LNG, which is Haisla Nation in BC, Indigenous led. There's some other projects that are Indigenous led that are coming down the pipe, and so that's an evolution. And so I hope you will see more and more of those types of Indigenous led projects.
And this is just a perception, Juan, as you've traveled throughout the Americas, as we call the land we all live in. But I have the sense that the Indigenous peoples are probably better represented in government at provincial and federal level than necessarily in Canada. Is that a correct perception?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think Indigenous people continue to be underrepresented, and this has complex reasons for it to be like this. I think it is unfair, but it is how it is today. And so, no, I think we have a long way to go for Indigenous peoples to be well represented at the government level, whether it is provincial or federal. Not that there aren't improvements. And if you look at it from a historic perspective, yes, there are some countries that can be proud of what they can show, but it's not, I would say it's not a rule in Latin America.
Okay, well, it certainly sounds like Ronald Reagan would be very happy listening to this discussion, because it's not starting with government is the solution. It's how do we make things happen with the communities on the ground, with the people who are in control, and thinking how they can be self-reliant and develop their communities, and then bring in the relevant partners. So it has really been enjoyable speaking with you today, Juan. Is there a particular point that you'd like to raise, or Rob, that you wanted to address? I think it's been pretty comprehensive and a nice different perspective.
I do think that there's one piece that I believe is important, which is doing this is not just the right thing to do, but this is actually very good business. What usually happens with investors who look at these projects and they're thinking about the risk return profile, they are used to doing projects in the traditional way, right? So when they look at the risk of social opposition, they actually don't see the risk. The risk is quite silent up until a project begins construction, right? And so I believe that when communities are included in a project, they're afraid of, this is going to create some governance issues. Who makes decisions? Who's responsible for the project? But when these partnerships are structured well, and Canada has 30 years of track record doing this, actually having the community involved from scratch and then as an equity partner is the best sign that your project is de-risked. And so it's a good sign moving forwards. You know that it's going to go well. It's the community asking you to invest. So I think that I would say that I would ask investors, when presented with equity partnerships, to actually look at it in a different way. It's like, how is this actually, how has this partnership been struck, been built? And then if it has been built well, how is this going to result in a de-risked project for us?
Yeah, great point, Juan, and well done to you as a non-Indigenous person and someone who spotted a trend in another part of the world and trying to make it and apply it to your part of the world. Love to see it, and I'll look forward to hearing how this all evolves. So thanks for being with us.
Yes.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. And I think it just reinforces, we chose to be in London, in the city, because the capital markets here and the money that's deployed from here around the globe. And you've reinforced that with the contribution, with the impact investing funds and with the UK, that, the Square Mile remains a place that it has this convening power, bringing together everything. So we look forward to seeing you at our summit on April 8th this year. And I'm sure we'll continue to have more and more people join us from around the world. So thank you very much for your time, Juan.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, and I definitely look forward to joining you in April.
Thank you to Juan Dumas for sharing his insights with us. And thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.